Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western Literary Canon out loud. Today we are continuing to journal collection number 48. This dates from the year 1857, when Emerson would turn 54 years old. With that said, it begins with a short poem, or at least a quotation from a poem, and then an editorial biographical update. So I'll read the poem and then go to the editorial update. O Hafiz, give me thought, in fiery figures cast, for all beside is naught, all else is din and blast. The winter brought its usual tasks, constant travel, audiences, new and old, much exposure, but also much refreshment to the retired scholar, and interesting contact with builders of the country, eager and active, and also with thinkers and dreamers who found in Mr. Emerson the first sympathy that had come to them in their views of life and religion, not understood by those among whom they were born. Besides lectures and lyceums near home, Mr. Emerson in January spoke at the People's Literary Institute in Philadelphia and in western New York, Ohio, and Illinois. In February, he gave lectures of the Conduct of Life course in New York and Newport. End of note. Chicago, Tremont House, January 1857. Quote, In 1838, said Dr. Boynton, I came here to Waukegan, and there were not so many houses as there are towns now. He got into the train at Evansville, a town a year and a half old, where are now 600 inhabitants. A biblical institute or divinity school of the Methodists, to which a Mrs. Garrett lately gave some land in Chicago, appraised at $125,000. But which, when they came to sell it, the worser half bought $160,000, and the value of the whole donation, 'tis thought, will be $500,000. They had in the same town a college, a thriving institution which unfortunately blew down one night, but I believe they raised it again the next day, or built another, and no doubt in a few weeks it will eclipse Cambridge and Yale. 'Tis very droll to hear the comic stories of the rising values here, which, ludicrous though they seem, are justified by facts presently. Mr. Corwin's story of land offered for $50,000 and an hour given to consider of it. The buyer made up his mind to take it, but he could not have it. It was 5 minutes past the hour, and it was now worth $60,000. After dinner he resolved to give the price, but he had overstayed the time again, and it was already $70,000, and it became $80,000 before night, when he bought it. I believe it was Mr. Corwin's joke, but the solemn citizens who stood by heard it approvingly and said, Yes, that is about the fair growth of Chicago per hour. However, a quite parallel case to this, I am told, actually occurred in the sale of the quote-unquote American house lot, which rose in a day from perhaps $40,000 to 50, 60, 70, 80, or 90,000, at which price it was sold. Mr. Foster of Evansville, when I asked about the once rival towns which competed with Chicago, said, Yes, at New York they once thought there was to be a great center and built 60 houses. Was there not a river and harbor there? Oh, yes, there was a guzzle out of a sandbank, but now there are still the 60 houses, and when I passed by the last time there was one owl which was the only inhabitant. Mr. W. B. Ogden told me that he came here from New York 21 years ago. In New York he had in association with some others made a large purchase here to the amount of $100,000. He had never been here, but wished to have a reason for coming beyond merely seeing the country, had never then been beyond Buffalo westward. He arrived here on morning, June 11th, 1836. He learned that one of the parties of whom he had purchased was in the house on his arrival at the tavern or fort, and this person sent for him to come up and see him. This Mr. Bronson had heard some rumor that his brother had sold the land to a company in New York, but hoped it was not so. Mr. Ogden showed him his deed. Bronson said it was all right, that it was injudicious in his brother. Ogden said he was glad to hear that, for he feared he had made a foolish bargain. While he was in Bronson's room, somebody tapped at the door and wished to know if the man who represented Block Number 1 was here. Mr. Ogden knew nothing of it, but Bronson told the man, yes, Ogden represented that purchase. Well, will you sell Block Number 1? Ogden replied he knew nothing of it, but after breakfast he would go and see the land. After breakfast they crossed in a little boat and looked about in the swamp and woods and came to a stake. Here, said Bronson, is Block Number 1. Well, they were followed by several persons, and among others the one he had seen. These came up, and the man said, what will you take for this property? Ogden said he knew nothing of its value, but if they would make him an offer, he would inform himself and answer. The man said, we will give you $35,000 for 8 blocks from number 1 to number 8. Ogden said, I never altered a muscle of my face, but I looked him in the face to see if he were joking and expected they would all laugh. But they all looked solemn, and the speaker no more crazy than the rest. So I took Bronson's arm and walked apart and said, is this a joke? Or are they crazy? Or is this the value of the land? Yes, this is the supposed value. Well, is it worth more? Perhaps, but you must wait. So I went back and said as gravely as I could that I would take it, that I expected them to laugh, but that would not harm me. But the man said, well, we will pay 10% down, and we will pay it now. But I said, we will go back to the tavern. But the man was uneasy and wished to pay now. I said, I shall not vary from what I have said. But the man inclined to pay now, so he took out of his pocket 10 $1,000 notes of the U.S. banks, and I put them in my waistcoat pocket. And from that time Mr. Ogden proceeded to sell piece after piece of the land, about 150 acres, till in 1 year he had nearly sold the whole for $1 million. Inspiration. Quote, the gods, says Homer, ever give to mortals their apportioned share of reason only on one day. End quote. Pindar, in one of his poems, represented Agamedes and Trophonius as rewarded by sudden death for building the temple of Apollo. He was afterwards referred by the priestess, on his inquiring what was best for mankind, to his own verses. He understood this reply as an intimation of his death, which soon after took place. Bond's Pindar, page 11. Quote, neither by sea nor by land canst thou find the way to the Hyperboreans. End quote. Quote, there are many swift darts under my elbow within my quiver, which have a voice for those with understanding, but to the crowd they need interpreters. End quote. Pindar. Agassiz. The turtles in Cambridge, on the publication of this book of Agassiz, should hold an indignation meeting and migrate from the Charles River. Cheledria serpentina marching at the head, and death to Agassiz inscribed on their shields. No matter what the savants say, tortoise or shark or sheep or ostrich, it is always man they have in their thought. Both professor and public are surreptitiously studying man, whom they would gladly read directly if they could. 'Tis a vast Aesop's fable, which prates about lions and foxes and storks, but means you and me from beginning to end. If natural philosophy is faithfully written, moral philosophy need not be, for that will find itself expressed in these theses to a perceptive soul. Agassiz discovered, quote, the coincidence between the embryonic development of beings and the gradation which is wrought from age to age in organic forms. End quote. A. Lagel, Revue des Deux Mondes, September. February. Captain John Brown of Kansas gave a good account of himself in the town hall last night to a meeting of citizens. One of his good points was the folly of the peace party in Kansas, who believed that their strength lay in the greatness of their wrongs, and so discountenanced resistance. He wished to know if their wrong was greater than the Negro's, and what kind of strength that gave to the Negro. He believes on his own experience that one good, believing, strong-minded man is worth 100, nay 20,000 men without character, for a settler in a new country, and that the right men will give a permanent direction to the fortunes of a state. For one of these bullying, drinking rowdies, he seemed to think cholera, smallpox, and consumption were as valuable recruits. The first man who went into Kansas from Missouri to interfere in the elections, he thought, quote, had a better right to be shot, end quote. He gave a circumstantial account of the battle at Blackjack, where 23 Missourians surrendered to 9 abolitionists. He had 3,000 sheep in Ohio and would instantly detect a strange sheep in his flock. A cow can tell its calf by secret signal, he thinks, by the eye, to run away or to lie down and hide itself. He always makes friends with his horse or mule, or with the deer that visit his Ohio farm, and when he sleeps on his horse, as he does as readily as in his bed, his horse does not start or endanger him. Brown described the expensiveness of war in a country where everything that is to be eaten or worn or used by man or beast must be dragged a long distance on wheels. Quote, God protects us in winter, he said. No Missourian can be seen in the country until the grass comes up again. End quote. Most men are insolvent, or promise by their countenance and conversation, and by their early endeavor much more than they ever perform. Charles Newcomb did, and Coleridge did, and Carlyle. Men's conscience, I once wrote, is local in spots and veins here and there, and not in healthy circulation through their system, so that they are unexpectedly good in some passage, and when you infer that they may be depended on in some other case, they heavily disappoint you. Well, so is their thought. A.T. dazzles with his intellectual light, but is a wretched hunker in politics, and hunks in social and practical life. And I learn from the photograph and doggermen that almost all faces and forms which come to their shops to be copied are irregular and unsymmetrical. The Democratic Party is the party of the poor marshaled against the rich. They are sure they are excluded from rich houses and society, and they vote with the poor against you. That is the sting that exasperates them and makes a strong party. But they are always officered by a few self-seeking deserters from the rich or Whig party. They know the incapacity of their own rank and file, and would reject one of their own nobodies as a leader. A few rich men or Whigs are therefore always ready to accept the place of captain and major and colonel and president, and wear their colors for their rewards, which are only to be given to the officers, and never to rank and file. But these leaders are Whigs and associates with Whigs. That is, they are the dining, drinking, and dancing and investing class, and by no means the digging and hoeing class. But 'tis of no use to tell me, as Brown and others do, that the Southerner is not a better fighter than the Northerner, when I see that uniformly a Southern minority prevails and gives the law. Why, but because the Southerner is a fighting man, and the Northerner is not. Think not the gods receive thy prayer in ear and heart, but find it there. Nature. She paints with white and red the moors, to draw the nations out of doors. Rule for rhetoric. Omit all the negative oppositions. I fear Agassiz takes quite too much time and space in denying popular science. He should electrify us by perpetual affirmations unexplained. Superlative. When a man says to me, I have the intensest love of nature, at once I know that he has none. The freedom of man consists herein that he is his own aim. Every man who stamps his personality on his life is the true, natural, and free man. Atlantis, February. I once knew of a man who drew a poor girl into his chamber. The girl quickly came to her penitence and said she was bitterly ashamed. Ashamed, said the man. What is there to be ashamed of? The speeches of our statesmen at Washington are much in the same clear key of correct sentiment, or like Talleyrand's reply to Bonaparte when he asked, "What is all this about non-intervention?" "Sire, it means about the same as intervention." Lord Normanby says of the French aristocracy in 1848, quote, "Country retirement in their own land has done more for them than exile in foreign parts formerly did." End quote. Lord Normanby says of the French aristocracy in 1848, quote, "Country retirement in their own land has done more for them than exile in foreign parts formerly did." End quote. Lord Normanby, when in Florence, had the foible of desiring to appear young. He quarreled with Landor, who published a letter against the ex-minister, which ended with these words, quote, "If we were not both, my lord, two miserable old dotards, trembling on the brink of the grave, this letter would be more pointed than it is." End quote. And then there's an untranslated passage in French here. Guizot said, quote, "The government would not engage itself for the future from the tribune. To promise was sometimes worse than to act, since to promise destroyed what existed without attempting to replace it." End quote. Nature, who made the lock, knows where to find the key. From the high to higher forces the scale of power uprears, the heroes on their horses, the gods upon their spheres. The man of the world bows with a vertical movement of the head up and down. My Stoic used a horizontal salutation as if always saying no. I suppose the same impulse of the air entering into the trachea of an ass will bray, and into the trachea of a nightingale will sing. Inspiration is as the receiver. Quote, "We cannot speak rightly about the gods without the gods." End quote. Jamblichus. I remember that I expected a revival in the churches to be caused by the reading of Jamblichus. I see the selfsame energy and action in a boy at football that I admire in the intellectual play of Burke and Pindar. Art. All your facts, my dear doctor, leave us outside, but a good word lets us into the world. Such is the eternal precedence of literature. 'Tis the law that each kind, when it becomes aware of a higher life, gladly abandons its own, and exchanges it for that. What would become of a fox who found out that it was a fox? Calvert said that when Fry had sung at his chambers in Paris to a French company, they were much struck with his person and performance, and one of the guests made his compliments to Calvert and told him how much he admired Fry. And then there is an untranslated French sentence here. And turning to Brian, who stood by with his white hair and beard, he suddenly added, and then of course something else in French. Conduct of life. Quote, "Wisdom is not found in the hand of those that live at their ease." End quote. Job. Art. You cannot make a cheap palace. Because our education is defective, because we are superficial and ill-read, we are forced to make the most of that position of ignorance. Hence America is a vast know-nothing party, and we disparage books and cry up intuition. With a few clever men we have made a reputable thing of that, and denouncing libraries and severe culture and magnifying the mother-wit swagger of bright boys from the country colleges, we have even come so far as to deceive everybody except ourselves into an admiration of unlearning and inspiration, forsooth. Miss Delia Bacon. Had she not been mistaken, she would have accomplished less. The author I bade rush to her proofs without digression or episode. Quote, "No man or woman has ever thought or written more sincerely than the author of this book." End quote. Hawthorne. Preface, page 12. 'Tis the school of a criticism much more severe than the criticism which calls its freedom in question. End quote. Quote, historical key to that art of delivery and tradition by means of which the secrets of the Elizabethan age are conveyed. End quote. Page 1. She has the virtue to believe in cause and effect. Miss Bacon has read much in these plays that the critics of the Athenaeum, etc., never read there and will never read. Shakespeare's plays, published in 1623, 3 years after Plymouth Colony. If they had been published first, the good forefathers had never been able to come away. The hater of property and of government takes care to have his warranty deed recorded, and the book written against fame and learning has the author's name on the title page. For joy and beauty planted it, with fairy gardens cheered, and boding fancy haunted it, with men and women weird. May 2nd. Walk yesterday, first day of May, with Henry Thoreau to Goose Pond and to the Red Chokeberry Lane. What follows, listener, is another list of Latin names for flowers. The editors have kindly given us the normal names of them, or at least the familiar names of them. I will read them off and then skip down to where he stops talking about it. They saw club mosses, spotted wintergreen, golden ragwort, and goldenrod. Saw the white-throated sparrow with a strong white stripe on the top of his head. Saw a stump of a canoe birch tree newly cut down, which had bled a barrel. From a white birch, Henry cut a strip of bark to show how a naturalist would make the best box to carry a plant or other specimen requiring care, and thought the woodman would make a better hat of birch bark than of felt. Hat with cockade of lichens thrown in. I told him the Birkbeiners of the Heimstringla had been before him. We will make a book on walking, 'tis certain, and have easy lessons for beginners. Quote, walking in 10 lessons. End quote. The legs of the thrones are the plow, and the oar, the anvil, and the sewing machine. A deep sympathy with intellect is what we require for any conversation, and it is hard to find among scholars. In writing, it is not propositions that are of the first need. Trees. They give us all our wreaths, but they reserve finer, for a wreath has worth and beauty according to the head on which it falls. A wreath dies on touching the head of a president. A man signing himself George R. of Madison, Wisconsin, and who seems to be drunk, writes me that, quote, the secret of drunkenness is that it insulates us in thought, whilst it unites us in feeling. End quote. May 19th. I saw Peter Kaufman in New York, a man of much intellectual power and of expansive moral sympathy and purposes, another Benjamin Franklin in his practical skill and tastes. Unhappily, he is without imagination, the more to be regretted that his life has kept him invariably bourgeois. His bonhomie and philanthropy occasionally changed his face to a wonderful degree, as if a young man looked out of an old mask. Editor's note. 17 years later, Mr. Emerson wrote the following into his journal. February 1874. On looking, I fear too late, into the singular diary which Kaufman sent me many years ago, I grieve that I neglected it until now. It is very imaginative and doubtless sincere, and indicates a far more intellectual person than I suspected in our short and singular meeting in New York. Alas, I have never heard from him or of him since, and I fear that his total silence on my part must have pained and alienated him. End note. May 25th. Yesterday, at the Cliff, with a family party and Henry Thoreau and Rixton, found the trailing arbutus and the cordalis. Henry has found new willows, and has a natural salactum where the seeds gather and plant themselves near the railroad. Saw the Salix rostrata discolor humulus. I think he finds 14. At this time of year the old leaves of the forest are gone, and the new not yet opened, and for a few days the view of the landscape is more open. At home, Blank expressed some sad views of life and religion. A thunderstorm is a terror to him, and his theism was Judaical. Henry thought a new pear tree was more to purpose, etc., but said better that an ecstasy was never interrupted. A theology of this kind is as good as a meteor or yardstick as any other. If I can be scared by a highwayman or a thunderclap, I should say my performances were not very high and should at once be mended. Thursday, May 28th. We kept Agassiz's 50th birthday at the club. 3 or 4 strangers were present, to wit, Dressel, Felton, Holmes, and Hilliard. For the rest, we had Agassiz, Pierce, Ward, Motley, Longfellow, Lowell, Whipple, Dwight, Woodman, and I. Cabot was due, but did not come. Agassiz brought what had just been sent him, the last colored plates to conclude the first volume of his contributions, etc., which will now be published incontinently. The flower of the feast was the reading of 3 poems, written by our 3 poets for the occasion. The first by Longfellow, who presided, the second by Holmes, the third by Lowell, all excellent in their way. May 30th. Walk this afternoon with Henry Thoreau. Found bellwort for the first time in Lincoln's by Flint's Pond. Found the chestnut-sided warbler, which I doubt not I have seen already and mistaken for the party-colored. Heard the note of the latter, which resembles a locust sound. Saw the cuckoo. Examined the young oak leaves by way of comparing the black, scarlet, and red, and think the penetrating the bark of the first to find the yellow chrysotrum must be for me the final test. Found the chestnut oak in Lincoln on Thompson's land not far from his boathouse, near large old chestnuts. Saw the 2 poplars, Grandionata and Trimifolia, which are both good for the powder mills. Henry thinks that planting acres of barren sand by running a furrow every 4 feet across the field with a plow and following it with a planter supplied with pine seed would be lucrative. He proposed to plant my Wyman lot so. Go in September and gather white pine cones with a hook at the end of a long pole, and let them dry and open in a chamber at home. Add acorns and birch seed and pitch pines. He thinks it would be profitable to buy cheap land and plant it so. Edward Gardiner at Nantucket sells the land at an advanced price as soon as he has planted it. It is a woodlot. Henry says that the flora of Massachusetts embraces almost all the important plants of America. We have all the willows but 1 or 2, all the oaks but 1 or 2, furrows 8 feet apart, and stick a pine along each at every 4 feet. Physiologie de Goût. Longfellow avoids greedy smokers. A cigar lasts 1 hour, but is not allowed to lose fire. Quote, "Give me the luxuries, the necessities may take their chance," end quote. And the appendix to this is Sam Ward's rule that the last thing an invalid is to give up is the going out to places of amusement, the theater, balls, concerts, etc., and Sir George Cornwell Lewis's saying that, quote, "life would be tolerable if it were not for the pleasures," end quote. I do not count the hours I spend in the woods, though I forget my affairs there and my books. And when there I wander hither and thither. Any bird, any plant, any spring detains me. I do not hurry homewards, for I think all affairs may be postponed to this walking, and it is for this idleness that all my businesses exist. I do not count the hours I spend in wandering by the sea. Our young men have nothing to do. Let them plant the land with good trees. Let them cut the sea with good boats. Let their friends like them best if they do nothing new or important, but win a living in the quietest old ways of shop and office. My naturalist has perfect magnanimity. He has no secrets. He will show you where his rare plants are, where the rare birds breed, carry you to the heron's haunt, or even to his most prized botanical swamp, confiding, I doubt not, that you can never find it again, yet willing to take his risks. To the pomologist, the young June moon had a sad reminder of the print of a curculio on his blue plume. And shall the canary bird only remind him of yellow fever, and the fireflies of incendiaries? June 9th. Yesterday, a walk with Henry in search of Actea alba, otherwise known as white baneberry, which we found but only one plant, and the petals were shed. The shrub also we saw which had puzzled him last year, and which was only viburnum nudum, grown more erect in the damp woods than usual. We found at Cyrus Smith's the Juglans nigra, black walnut in flower. It blooms with the pignut Juglans glabra, and not with the butternut Juglans cinerea. I do not find black walnut in Bigelow. Henry praises Bigelow's descriptions of plants, but knows 60 plants not recorded in his edition of Bigelow, 1840. We saw the hairy woodpecker watching his chirping brood in an apple tree in Wyman's orchard. Spider will show whether the whole is inhabited or not. The red maples are conspicuous in these days with red keys. Saw swamp white oak under the handsome pleached elm on the road from the manse to Peter Hutchinson's. The day was joyfully bright and warm, but at night coldish again. Saw the leather-colored or dead oak-leaf-colored wood frog. In the morning we saw dwarf dandelion. On Sunday, June 6th, on our walk along the river bank, the air was full of the ephemerides, which Henry celebrates as the manna of the fishes. Scholar and Times. Could I make you feel your indispensableness? And yet it behooves first to show you the joy of your high place. You have the keys, you deal with design and the methods. Here lies this wide aboriginal nature, old beyond figures, yet new and entire, the silver flame which flashes up the sky. No eons can date it, yet there it burns as delicately as the passing cinder of the firefly with the lightness of a new petal. Here you rest and work in this element of space, whose bewildering circuits make all the universe a dot on its margin, dwarfing the gods. To teach us this first lesson of humility, God set down man in these two vastitudes of space and time, yet he is such an incorrigible peacock that he thinks them only a perch to show his dirty feathers on. What we accept in generals, we deny in particulars. But the applicability is not capricious, this applicability by which planets subside and crystallize and clothe themselves with forests and animate themselves with beasts and men will not stop, but will continue into finer particulars and from finer to finest evermore. For every creature has a sphere and a predisposing power. He is not possible unless the invisible things are right for him as well as the visible. There are more belongings to every creature than his lair and his food. I have sought for thee a costlier dome than Mohammed's palace high, and thou returned shall find thy home in the apple of lover's eye. Editor's note: Mr. Emerson was translating German versions of Hafitz into English. At this time he was preparing an ode for the 4th of July breakfast in Town Hall, see in the poems. Although he did not introduce the following verses, he did not omit his plea to the country to purge itself from the blot of slavery. End note. O sun, take off thy hood of clouds, O land, take off thy chain, and fill the world with happy mood and love from main to main. Ye shall not on this charter day disloyally withhold their household rights from captive men by pirates bought and sold. Ah, little knew the innocent in throes of birth forlorn that wolves and foxes waited for their victim to be born. Zoologists may dispute whether horsehairs in the water change to worms. Wednesday, July 8th. This morning I had the remains of my mother and of my son Waldo removed from the tomb of Mrs. Ripley to my lot in Sleepy Hollow. The sun shone brightly on the coffins, of which Waldo's was well preserved, now 15 years. I ventured to look into the coffin. I gave a few white oak leaves to each coffin after they were put into the new vault, and the vault was then covered with 2 slabs of granite. There is certainly a convenience in the money scale in the absence of finer meters. Clubs. In the East they buy their wives at stipulated prices. Well, shall I not estimate when the finer anthropometer is wanting my social property so? In our club no man shall be admitted who is not worth in his skin 500,000. One of them I hold worth 1,000,000, for he bows to facts, has no impertinent will, and nobody has come to the end of his resources. So in my house I shall not deign to count myself by my poor taxable estate 20 or 30,000, but each of my children is worth, on leaving school, 100,000, as being able to think, speak, feel, and act correctly, able to fill the vacant hours and keep life up to a high point. Sunday, July 19th. A visit to Josiah Quincy, Jr., on his old place at Quincy, which has been in the family for 7 generations since 1635, and the deed by which the place is holden is in order on the first page of the records of the town of Boston. Quote, ordered that Edmund Quincy and one other named party lay out 800 acres at Mount Wollaston. There lives the old president, now 85 years old, in the house built by his father in 1770, and Josiah Jr. in a new house built by Billings 7 years ago. They hold 500 acres, and the land runs down to the sea. From the piazza in the rear of the house of Josiah Quincy, Jr., you may see every ship that comes in or goes out of Boston, and most of the islands in the harbor. 'Tis the best placed house I know of. The old man I visited on Saturday evening, and then on Sunday he came and spent the evening with us at his son's house. He is the most fortunate of men. Old John Adams said that of him, and his good fortune has followed to this hour. His son said to me, quote, my father has thrown 10 times, and every time got doublets, Yet he was engaged to a lady whose existence he did not know of 7 days before, and she proved the best of wives. I made a very pleasant acquaintance with young Josiah III, the poet of Listeria, and I like him better than his poem. Charles Francis Adams also was there in the Sunday evening. Old Quincy still reads and writes with vigor and steadiness 2 or 3 hours every night after tea till 10. He has just finished his, quote, Life of John Quincy Adams, Montaigne's story of the man who learned courage from the hare weighs with me. 'Tis the best use of fate to teach us courage like the Turk. Every man tries his hand at poetry somewhere, but most men don't know which their poems are. July 26th. Ellery Channing thinks that these frogs at Walden are very curious but final facts, that they will never be disappointed by finding themselves raised to, quote, a higher state of intelligence, The, quote-unquote, Sakuntala ends with a prayer of the king, quote, and may the purple, self-existent God, whose vital energy pervades all space, from future transmigrations save my soul, He persists in his bad opinion of orchards and farming, declares that the only success he ever had with farmers was that he had once paid a cent for a Russeton apple, and farming he thinks is an attempt to outwit God with a hoe, that they plant a great many potatoes with much ado, but it is doubtful if they ever get the seed again. July 28th. Yesterday, the best day of the year, we spent in the afternoon on the river. A sky of Calcutta, light, air, clouds, water, banks, birds, grass, pads, lilies were in perfection, and it was delicious to live. Ellery and I went up to the South Branch and took a bath from the banks behind Cyrus Hubbard's, where the river makes a bend. Blackbirds in hundreds, swallows in tens sitting on the telegraph lines, and one heron, Ardea minor, assisted. In these perfect pictures, one thinks what weary nonsense is all this painful collection of rubbish, pictures of rubbish masters, and the total neglect of this and every lovely river valley, where the multitudinous life and beauty make these pictures ridiculous, cold chalk and ochre. From Faraday's lecture at the Royal Institute, 1857, on "conservation of force." A grain of water is known to have electric relations equivalent to a very powerful flash of lightning. It may therefore be supposed that a very large apparent amount of the force causing the phenomena of gravitation may be the equivalent of a very small change in the unknown condition of the bodies, whose attraction is varying by change of distance. Many considerations urge my mind toward the idea of a cause of gravity which is not resident in the particles of matter merely, but constantly in them in all space." A particle of oxygen is ever a particle of oxygen. Nothing can in the least wear it. Faraday is an excellent writer and a wise man, and whilst I read him, I think that, if natural philosophy is faithfully written, moral philosophy need not be, for it will find itself expressed in these theses to a perceptive soul. That is, we shall read of the commandments and gospels in chemistry without need of translation, as we read a Latin or a French book to scholars without a translation. I can count on my fingers all the sane men that ever came to me. Were I to insist on silence until I was fully met, and all my faculty called out and tasked by my companion, I should have a solitary time of it. Those who visit me are young men, imperfect persons, people with some partial thought or local culture. Each man has, too, 6 or 7 leading thoughts or observations, and his talk with a stranger as it rises or falls is usually a pure or diluted statement of these, until they are all told. Then if the stranger has not evinced the power to excite and draw him out, they live thenceforward in heavy relation, as people who know each other to disadvantage and who have nothing to expect from each other. This is the end of Part 1 of Journal Collection number 48, dating from the year 1857, when the author was 54 years old. Thank you for listening.